Hey everyone, I'm Bruce, the GMAT guy, and I'm here to tell you about how the GMAT really works and the things you actually need to know to do well. Now, some of those things you probably already know, but a lot of them nobody is telling you about. The reason I know this stuff is because I've been coaching the GMAT for kind of a long time. I founded First Choice Admissions. Our URL is on the bottom there if you need some help studying or if you want to check us out. All right, enough talking. Let's dive in and start digging into the stuff that's actually going to raise your score. Here are the things we're going to cover. We're going to talk about the 3 things that the GMAT actually tests, or what 3 things you actually need to know and focus on in order to score well on the GMAT. We're going to talk about how the GMAT scoring works and what that means to you, and it turns out it really means a lot. And we're also going to go through some advanced scoring and pacing strategies that you can use immediately to improve your score. To do well on the GMAT, you really have to concentrate on 3 things. First, you got to know stuff. There's no way around it. You have to be able to do the algebra and the geometry. You have to be able to answer that rate question and figure out if that subject agrees with that verb. The thing is, though, that's only about half of what you need to know. The other half that's really important to know to do well on the test, nobody talks very much about. A big chunk of that is how you interpret and think through questions. For every question type, the GMAT expects you to think through the question in a really particular GMAT-y way. Now, if someone's told you what that really GMAT-y particular way is, the test gets a lot easier. But if no one's told you that, well, the test is a lot harder to score well on. And finally, the GMAT structure and scoring is unlike any other test you've ever taken. And the way the test scores you has a huge impact on how you need to take the test in order to maximize your score. And it's this part, the scoring and the pacing, that we're going to concentrate on for the rest of the video. So let's talk about how the GMAT scores you. Unlike a paper and pencil test, like say the SAT, take the GMAT on a computer and it uses an algorithm to zero in on your score, and it works something like this. Go to a testing center, you sit down at the terminal, and the GMAT basically says, hey, I don't know you, so let's start you off here at about a 500. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you a question and we'll just see how you do. Now, the question you're going to get from the GMAT is a question that about half the test takers get right and about half get wrong. So let's say you get it right. A couple things happen. First thing is your score goes up kind of by a lot. And the second thing is the GMAT says, hey, not bad. Let's give you another one. This one's going to be a little harder. So the GMAT goes, it gives you a harder question. Let's say you get that question right. Again, your score goes up. And again, the GMAT says, hey, that's pretty good. Let's give you another question. It's going to be a little harder still. So the GMAT gives you a harder question. Let's say you get that question wrong. Okay, so your score goes down, and the GMAT says, okay, well, you missed that one. I'm now going to give you another one, and this question is going to be a little easier. So then it gives you another question. It's a little easier. Let's say you get that one right. GMAT says, nice job. And guess what? The next question you get is a little harder. And it's through this process that GMAT zeroes in on your score. Now, there's a little bit of subtlety and nuance that goes along with this that's important, that we're going to talk about next. And it's that subtlety and nuance that your strategy is going to come from. It's important to know a couple things about how the GMAT scores you. One of the most important things to remember is not all questions are worth the same number of points. In fact, the first 10 questions or so are really important. You tend to see really big score swings on those first 10 questions because what the test is doing is roughing in your score. Surprisingly, after about the first 10 questions, the test already thinks it knows about what your final score is going to be. The test takes really the rest of the questions to confirm its initial assessment of your score and to really fine-tune your score. So in this case, the test is really trying to figure out if this test taker is kind of a 700 scorer or a 710 scorer, or maybe a 690 scorer. Now I can hear some of you already saying, if the first questions are worth so much more, why don't I just spend all my time on those? Well, that's a really good question with a really good answer. Because the penalties for getting strings of questions wrong at the end of sections, or guessing at the end of sections, or not finishing sections are vicious. In fact, the GMAT is going to penalize you about double in those scenarios. So if you try that strategy, your performance will end up looking something like this. You keep getting questions right, but each question will get harder and harder and, more importantly, take up more and more time. So what's going to happen is you're going to get to the end of the section, you're going to run out of time, and then the penalty monster is going to appear and he is just going to eat your score. Don't let that happen to you. Okay, so you're thinking, if that strategy doesn't work, then what does? It's a good question, and I have one word: pacing. What I mean by pacing is this. Those first 10 questions are still really important, and I want you to try and get as many of those first 10 right as you can and still climb as high as you can within a time limit. Give yourself about 25 minutes for those first 10 questions. The middle 20 questions, bank about 35 minutes, and leave yourself about 15 minutes for the last questions. Now, a couple things about pacing that are really important. Pacing varies from person to person. And it depends on their skill level, and it depends what score they're going for on the test. The pacing I'm illustrating here is a pretty good starting point, but it's really important for you to take some practice tests and find the ideal pacing for you and your goals. Now remember, your pacing between your quant and verbal is likely to be different. Not only are you probably stronger in one area than another, but remember, there are more verbal questions than there are quant questions. Now that you know how the scoring works, let's check off on a couple important things. Important thing number one. The test is really trying to figure out the point at which you answer about half the questions right and about half the questions wrong. The algorithm is searching for that kind of delicate balancing point where it asks you a question that's just easy enough that you're able to get it right, but then it triggers the next question that's just hard enough that you miss it. So in theory, your performance looks like one right, one wrong, one right, one wrong, etc. And that's really what that green squiggly line is trying to represent. Important thing number two, this means that you're going to get some questions wrong, regardless of whether you're scoring a 700 or a 550. That's simply how the test works. And I know for you perfectionists out there, and I know there are a lot of you out there, you're thinking, well, this isn't good news. I know I'm going to end up getting a bunch of questions wrong. It really is good news, because that means you don't have to get a perfect score in order to score really, really well on the test. In fact, don't try. Don't be a hero. You need to be a little smarter than that. If you try and beat every problem that you get, you're going to end up in a time crunch at the end. Instead, don't try and beat every problem. Remember, try and beat the test. Your goal isn't to get that one problem right. Your goal is to get the highest score possible on the test. So that means you have to train yourself to eject from questions that are taking too long and use the time that you save on that question to answer the next question correctly. And I'm not advocating, ejecting out of half the questions or anything like that. What I'm saying is, if you're 45 seconds or a minute into a question and you're still swimming, you're still not seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, that's a candidate to eject out of. Now, I know this is hard, especially when you just know you can answer that question if you're given enough time. You really need to learn how to do that. It really is a key to getting a good score, because the worst case scenario is you end up spending too much time on a question and you end up getting it wrong. The second worst case scenario is you spend too much time on a question and get it right. And this is why. Say you spend 5 minutes on a question and you get it right. Woohoo! The problem is you could have gotten 2 questions right down the line if you wouldn't have spent so much time on that question. So again, be smart. Don't beat the problem, beat the test. So let's review the highlights of what we learned here. First, the GMAT is about 3 things. It's about knowledge. You gotta have quant and verbal skills. It's about interpretation. You really have to think through the questions in this very specific GMAT-y way. And it's about scoring. The GMAT uses an algorithm to determine your score for the verbal and quant portions of the test, and it finds a point at which you get about half the questions right and about half of them wrong. And there are big penalties for not finishing a section or guessing at the end of sections. So, pacing is key and your best friend. The idea is to get as many correct answers as you can in the time limit you've given yourself for each section. Also, don't be afraid to eject out of questions that are taking too long. And I know this part is really hard, so I want you to take practice tests to hone your technique. Thanks for watching this video on how the GMAT scores the math and verbal parts of the test. The next videos are all going to be about interpreting questions. That is, how exactly does the GMAT want you to think through the different question types? And like I mentioned, it's really specific. I'm Bruce, the GMAT guy. I'm founder of First Choice Admissions. We help students all over the world prep for the GMAT. So if you'd like a little bit of help preparing for your GMAT, check us out. Thanks so much. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.